Hello and welcome to this edition of TZM Global Radio. I'm your host for today, James Phillips from the UK lecture team of the Zeitgeist movement and TZM Education. The opening for today's show was a video played at ZDAY World event in Los Angeles by Federico Pistono. I think it's a really fantastic video that sums up the direction in which our species must head on this planet now. The only missing words from that video were at the end, which were, and now go and do something amazing. I couldn't agree more. So, I hope you all had a really, really good Z-Day. I know we sure did in London. I think it was probably one of the best ones I've ever been to. The format for the day was what really did it for me. Seeing all of these exterior organisations come together in one room, recognise the challenges that we face in the future, and actually saying we're prepared to work on this together. Because ultimately, if we're not prepared to work on this together, then things are just going to carry on much the same as they are. That's what critical mass is all about, after all, eh? I don't think it would be very wise for us as a movement to think that the only way this change is possible is if everybody joins the Zeitgeist movement. It becomes almost like a cult or a church then when you have that kind of perspective. So rather than looking in, we should be looking out, and we should be inviting exterior organisations to our events, even if they're going to say, well, I don't agree with you on certain things. Great, we want to hear what they are. Let's have a discussion. Maybe there's actually more common ground than there isn't when you actually talk to people. If you're not going to talk to them, you can just assume that you don't have common ground on certain things, when actually you probably do. Even the political establishment is not founded on the idea that we should all not have some sort of harmony in the world. If you look at the actual ideals proposed through political theory, very often it's got some good intention in it. It's not intended incorrectly, but if you're going to use the incorrect method and the incorrect tools to accomplish your aim, then you really shouldn't be that surprised when you fall wide of the mark. So these organisations that we invited to Z-Day were cherry-picked, if you will, to expose an aspect of what we talk about, what we allude to, and show that more people are circling in on the root cause of the problems in society. So that was the real thing that came out of the day for me that was really positive. And our future events in London, our town hall events, are going to feature a guest speaker at probably every single one, or at least as many as we possibly can, to showcase other organisations who are working on a particular aspect that we advocate. And that's really what I tried to slam home in my lecture on Z-Day. So what I'm going to be doing with my radio shows for the foreseeable future is including a lecture from London ZDAY and also continuing to read from the First Civilization, as well as doing the usual sort of news updates and what have you. In terms of news updates, actually, Federico Pistono's recent trip to the UK was a huge success. It entailed him coming along to the school that I had an event at and giving a talk to people based on his work through his book, Robots Will Steal Your Job, but that's okay. And it was fascinating to see Federico say to 300 18-year-olds about to go to university who probably have aspirations of going into certain fields of work, and him sticking some of those fields of work up on the board and saying, right, if you're thinking of any of these jobs, yeah, you might want to think again, because they're probably not going to be here. And then actually backing that up with complete and total evidence was a fascinating thing to see. You could certainly hear the tumbleweed go through the room and the sort of shock, if you will, on the teachers' and students' faces when he delivered that bombshell. It is a fascinating thing to see. So he did really well there, and the day went very well. And then onwards, Federico had a debate with the socialists in London, which was fiery, to say the least. And if we're going to be honest, some people in the room were rather rude and inhospitable. But Federico dealt with that with a huge level of professionalism and just went straight back to the evidence and the science and brought it all forth from there. And I thought that he did very, very well. But a huge thanks goes out to the socialists for having Federico come along and have that debate with them. They were themselves extremely hospitable, and the debate was conducted in a very professional manner, and I thought their speaker from the socialists was excellent on a lot of areas. Nonetheless, what my question to the panel was, and what Federico tried to echo, was the idea that we have more in common than we actually have apart. The difference is that, and I'm paraphrasing here, the Socialist Party seemed to think that if we just dispossess the capitalist class, then everything is going to go swimmingly. On a certain level, I can agree with this. If you look at the 1,000 richest people in the UK and how much money they have, which I think is 400 billion or something in excess, which would easily pay off the national debt and leave them with quite a bit of money left over, thank you very much. You can see the merits in their argument.
However, that is what money does, I'm afraid, folks.
It does it over and over and over again. So you've got to address the root cause. You've got to build a technical approach that obviates the need for that gravitation towards hierarchy and dominance and social stratification. If you don't do that, you're really not on to much. And that's where Federico tried to sort of bring his argument from, to argue that it's us that prop up this system by what we buy into, by what we consume, by who we vote for, by our participation in this system, rather than our non-participation in it wherever possible, and looking towards building our way out of this technically, through technology, through some of the work that Federico's been doing in all sorts of areas, but one of them being online type programs where you can set up schools in foreign countries and translate the web into different languages so that more people have access to education. These sorts of things are what will change the zeitgeist out there, really, slowly but surely. It's within that we can really start to erode this power dominance. And I think that is the main sort of thrust of our point, really, towards the socialist movement. But that's not saying that we don't share their sentiment, otherwise we wouldn't be here. But I think an emotional disposition towards this sort of stuff, and if that's all it is, isn't really going to solve anything. You've got to back it up with some evidence. You've got to back it up with some technicals. And really, that's something that's important to note, that the movement, whilst it may seek this change on one human level, if you will, where we would like to see a more collaborative world work together and solve the challenges that lie ahead, it really is just a technical plan. When you step back from it, that's all it is. It depends on what function you want your economy to serve. Federico also brought up a very good point that capitalism, if you want growth, is an awesome idea. It does that very well. It does growth and social stratification and division and things like that excellently. But it doesn't do what we're going for now. It wasn't designed to do what we're going for now. And if you're just trying to patch this up, it's not going to work. And if you do dispossess the capitalist class, it's only going to end up back where it was in the first place. And besides, it's all nice to say that we shouldn't have money, but who's going to clean the shit out of the sewers? It ain't going to be me. It's lovely that you've got that idea, but I don't want to do that job. I don't want to do a crappy job. So do you have the technicals that obviates the need for people to be employed doing jobs like that they don't want to do? Do you have a system, a technical system, to obviate the need for having that job done by a human being? Because if you don't, I'm afraid you're still going to have a monetary system, and therefore you're still going to have an awful lot of problems that aren't going to be solved by just socialism alone. And the speaker was very forthright about saying that socialism is the only answer. And I have to say, it doesn't seem very scientific to me to hedge all your bets into one higher order abstract word that doesn't really actually have a physical referent either. That seems to me to be a little bit foolhardy. I don't even say that, the Zeitgeist movement's the only answer. We're not saying that. We're saying that natural law is natural law, and you are part of nature. So it's a dictatorship, actually, regardless of what you think. It doesn't matter what label you put on it. You can put resource-based economy, natural law economy, the Zeitgeist movement, the Venus Project. It doesn't really matter what you call it. If you don't have an economy that doesn't take into account the natural world and our effect on it, and our effect on our resources and our environment that we need in order for us to survive, then I'm afraid you don't really have a system that makes sense. And that is absolute. I don't think anybody can really come up with a point, and I don't think we're being too dogmatic to say that. We haven't found many people from anywhere that really denies this. And if you look at the political system at the moment, they're not walking around saying, oh, there's no problem with the environment, it's fine, don't worry about it, get back in your cars, go to work. They're not really saying that. They're saying, oh, no, we need to cut our emissions and we need to recycle and stuff. So there's an admittance there, because if they weren't admitting it, everybody would obviously smell a huge rat and say, what the hell are you talking about? So they sort of do these things and somehow naively think that it's going to solve the problem. But the fact is, at least they're admitting it. So no one's really out there saying, oh, no, we can just carry on consuming and we can carry on polluting the atmosphere and we can carry on doing these things. Even the system itself doesn't say that we can do that. It's just not able to go as far as it needs to go, because to do that, it would have to question the whole premise of its function entirely, which goes against its intrinsic interests. And that's the point. That's the point. That when you're too dogmatic with a religious belief or a political belief or a belief of any sort, then you're not able to adapt to the ever-emergent understanding and changing state of the natural world, or at least our understanding of it. But just to be clear, I think I can probably speak for everyone when I say that we share the socialist horror and disgust at the fact that 1,000 people inside a country of 60 million or more can have a combined wealth of over 400 billion, and actually increase to that number to the tune of 155 billion in just the last 3 years. And then their government has the audacity to say we need to cut benefits and we need to cut public services. And why do we need to cut these things? To pay off the national debt. Now, of course, you never hear them say, well, money's created out of debt through fractional reserve banking, so we could probably just shift our attention away from that and actually create money in a different manner so that it actually serves some sort of functional role in society. Then that's certainly going to obviate the need for even having such a massive national debt in the first place, which is, of course, created by banks. But you know what? Fine. Let's say fractional reserve banking makes perfect sense, and we really do need to pay off this debt. Let them pay it off. They've got enough money, and the chances are they probably caused the problem in the first place. You can call that socialism if you want, but if you have that form of social stratification in society, you can expect problems. But of course, the reason you don't hear things like that is perfectly understandable. Why would the mainstream media go that far outside the spectrum of debate to suggest something as hideous as actually taking the money off of the people who caused this problem in the first place? Why would they do that? They're owned by those people. It's a great big rich list gangbang, and I'm afraid we're not invited. Anyway. One other thing that I did mention in the debate that I think is important to note, that I've started to do recently, is that when people say, oh, the problem's capitalism, I say, I want capitalism, bring it on. They're like, what? I thought we had it. No, sorry, we don't. Capitalism says that if you fail, you're fucked. Okay? That's what it says. So let's take a look at 2008, shall we? How many, and the too big to fail. I don't remember the original thinkers of capitalism saying that. I don't know. I could be wrong on this, and please do set me straight if I am. But I thought the idea is that if you fail in capitalism, then tough shit. The market didn't want you anymore. Sorry. Come up with a better idea. That's what the free market's based on, right? Well, great. Let's have a free market then. Let's have one. Oh, we haven't got one. Well, what have you got? Oh, we've got basic modern feudalism. We've got a plutocracy, the ruling of a very tiny rich elite that control everybody's lives. And I said in a debate, look, call it what it is. Call it bitchism. Okay? This is my new ism. What we live in is bitchism. Basically, there's a very, very, very small fraction of society that basically control all of the media, control all of the money, control how money circulates, control this great big looming mound of debt above everybody. They don't give a shit what you do, and you're their bitch. So, it's bitchism. There you go. Welcome to bitchism. And nobody likes to be anybody's bitch when you tell them that that's what they are. So I'm sure they'll probably turn around and say, I don't want to live in that. And I think that's probably a better way to go. Let's drop the capitalism and socialism and just roll it into one. Eh? I don't know. It's an idea I'll float out there. I don't know whether it will get any ground, but there you go. Anyway, away from that little rant there. And in terms of movement news, obviously the ZDAY LA World event went very well. I haven't been able to watch all of the lectures yet, but of the ones I did see, they were fantastic, as usual. And by all accounts, people had a very, very good time at that event. So, later on in today's show, as I mentioned earlier, I will be reading from The First Civilization. But first of all, what I'd like to do is include the opening lecture from ZDAY London 2013, which is a lecture given by myself, entitled Joining the Dots, Drawing the Picture of Transition. Just one thing to mention before I play this. There is a joke near the end in which you would definitely need to know what the slide is all about. And that particular slide is a picture of Peter Joseph, our esteemed leader and commandant, sitting in the jacuzzi being fed strawberries in a pink jacket by half-naked ladies. Just the sort of cult behaviour that you should expect from an esteemed leader of a new social movement. Used to illustrate a very funny point. And by the way, if you haven't seen Culture in Decline 4 yet, I'm sorry if I ruined that absolutely priceless moment of comedic genius by Peter. Very, very funny. I mean, I laughed until it hurt when I saw that. I'm sure I wasn't alone. The terms I used in an email to Peter was that I laughed until a little bit of wee came out, which is an amusing image. Anyway, moving on swiftly, here's my lecture from ZDAY 2013 in London, entitled Joining the Dots, Drawing the Picture of Transition. Enjoy, guys.
Hello, welcome to ZDAY London 2013. Your presence here today is the first important step in raising awareness about the possibility of a better world, so thank you all very much for coming. My name's James Phillips. I'm a member of the London chapter and the UK lecture team for the Zeitgeist movement. As an organisation which seeks a radical paradigm shift in our conduct as a species on this planet, the Zeitgeist movement is often asked an incredibly important question. How do we get from here to there? Or the question of transition. This year's ZDAY has been designed to address this question in both form and content, and that's why this presentation is entitled Joining the Dots, Drawing the Picture of Transition. I'd encourage you to write down your questions throughout the day. As schedule permitted, we should have time for a Q&A at the end by a panel from the movement, as well as a short one at the end of each speaker as well. So, why all the fuss? Why do we even exist as an organisation in the first place? Well, because something is very wrong in our world, I'm afraid. For in a world where 1% owns 40% of the world's wealth, 50% live on less than $3 a day, 80% on less than 10, and a sixth of the planet's human population are starving to death, something is obvious. Our current approach to running human society on a global scale in an effort to meet human needs is clearly not working. And if for some reason you think that this is acceptable or that we're generally moving in the right direction, then I'm afraid you still face an evolutionary precipice on an ecological level in the wake of huge levels of resource depletion in the insane quest for infinite growth on a finite planet. For the facts are that we will need 2 Earths by 2030 to keep up our current rates of consumption. The last remaining rainforest could be consumed in less than 40 years. Species are going extinct at 1,000 times their normal rate due to human activity. Over 70% of the world's fish species are disappearing at an alarming rate due to overfishing, and 99% of all resources harvested from nature in the United States ends up as waste within 6 weeks. So, sorry if you were hoping for a nice chirpy little opening to your day, but I'm afraid the gloves are off. To call this wasteful joke of a system and economy is an affront to our intelligence. An economy is supposed to economize. What we have does the polar opposite and would be better referred to as an anti-economy. The backbone of this structure is something called cyclical consumption. This is basically the extraction, manufacturing and exchange of goods and services at an ever-increasing rate in order to speed up the circulation of money in the system and keep the so-called economy growing. Any other organism that behaved in such a way towards its life host would be referred to as cancer. And as for claiming that we have a civilization, I would say that we would surely have to be civilized first, right? And a world that spends what it would cost to feed all the starving people on it for a year in just 8 days on war doesn't seem all that civil to me. I think astronomer and author Carl Sagan put it best when he said, "We are one organism sharing one planet, and an organism at war with itself is doomed." And this is why we exist. The Zeitgeist movement is an educational sustainability advocacy group engaged in spreading positive value orientations to the surrounding culture. For when we step back far enough to look for the causal mechanisms behind these effects, we find that these issues are not due to some rogue flaw in human nature or a mere transgression of the patchwork system of problem solving referred to as the law. Rather, they are symptoms of and in direct relational response to the premises of the current socio-economic paradigm itself. And it's the culmination of our overall cultural values that support this structure. Without shift in these, I'm afraid there will never be a workable alternative. So the clue is in the name, really, as the term Zeitgeist refers to the intellectual, moral and cultural climate of an era. And movement refers to motion or change. Therefore, the Zeitgeist movement seeks a transition away from the values of rampant consumption as a measure of social health, resource theft, corruption, and monopolistic collusion, towards environmental and social sustainability, collaboration, and access abundance on a global scale in an effort to meet the human needs of the entire population. We recognize that the world is, in fact, one synergistic, interconnected organism and must be treated as such if we are to face the many challenges that lie ahead. So what's the plan for these bold claims? Well, to understand this, we first of all need to do a little bit of back history. The movement was founded in 2008 by documentary filmmaker Peter Joseph and was initially the communication arm of another organization, the Venus Project, the founder of which was industrial designer, inventor and futurist Jacques Fresco. He saw way back in the days of the Great Depression that if a new system of planetary management was not employed, then we were simply setting the stage for our own destruction. The system he's worked on his whole life on designing that the movement advocates and promotes could be referred to as a resource-based economy. A resource-based economy, or natural law economy as it's sometimes known, is an economic system like no other before it. It's the first to directly apply a completely different decision-making method towards the management of society. It's not derived from some random think tank or egotistic philosophical or political opinion, but rather from the most accurate and empirical decision-making method we have ever come to know of as a species, the scientific method. Science is quite simply the best approach we have for predicting future events and making more accurate measurements of the physical reality we all share. It's completely devoid of human opinion or ego, and as shown here is simply asking a question, doing some research, developing what you consider to be a reasonable answer, otherwise known as a hypothesis, devising an experiment to test that hypothesis through empirical observation and measurement, and drawing a conclusion from the analyzed test results. Others can then repeat your experiment to verify its validity. It never proposes the truth, it merely seeks it and updates itself through new findings. For all the intellectualized snobbery that often follows science around, it's actually remarkably simple and is in fact the most commonly used decision-making method in existence. It's simply environmental feedback, and in this way we are all scientists on one level or another, for we engage in it when we run the hypothesis carried out in the previous experiment, when opening a door, going to the fridge, or driving a car. Let's throw in a new factor. Let's say the car doesn't start when you turn the key. Is that A, due to demons possessing it? Or B, because there's a mechanical fault of some kind? It's obviously B. So what's the appropriate decision in this situation? Is it to operate on the logic of the character Basil Fawlty from the sitcom Fawlty Towers and attack it with the remnants of a tree? Or to decipher the most probable area of causality, aka problem solving? Which is essentially what the scientific method is, a problem-solving method by which we arrive at decisions rather than making them. So what's the difference between arriving at a decision and making one? Take a plot of land. 4 families live on the plot of land and they decide to plant a fruit tree for food. Which place is the best place for them to plant the fruit tree? A, B, C, or D? Now, B is the one screaming out at you, right? But in this figurative example, at least, it's actually D. You see, the scientific method states that you have to take into account all the known variables interacting on the tree's ability to produce the highest amount of food. So that's the pH level of the soil, the best place for irrigation, sunlight, and so on. So by using such a different decision-making process towards planetary management, we'll naturally arrive at an extremely different perspective in social design than the one we have now. But it's not like it would be the first time we've had to update our understandings as a species. For fight change as we may, it is in fact the only constant. Remember that we once thought the world was flat, the centre of the universe, that drilling holes in heads would relieve migraines, slavery was fine, and the Roman Empire would last forever. Needless to say that our understandings of what the truth is has had to change over time, and there's no reason to think that this trend has suddenly stopped. So with this new decision-making process in play, let's run through a thought exercise to learn the basics of how a resource-based economy, or RBE, works. Imagine that we discover a new Earth identical to our planet but untouched by humans, and we can move all the humans from this planet to our new Earth. Where would we start in an effort to build our new society? Well, wouldn't it make sense first to discover what we have on board our planetary spaceship by doing a resource survey? So this can be done now with existing technologies such as satellites and sensors and so on. This would take into account all relevant factors pertaining towards optimal global resource management, but let's take the lifeblood of society as an example of this approach, energy. We would survey where and what the energy potentials are and plot them into a chart listing all the relative retroactions and potentials of those mediums such as output, renewability, pollution and alike, and then draw inference as to the most efficient and strategic approach to meet our energy needs. This would be based on our most up-to-date understanding and technological approaches at the time, of course. And this is where the news is very good, because we have nothing but an abundance of clean energy right at our fingertips. A 2005 Stanford University study found that by harnessing just 20% of the potential of wind energy, we could supply half of all the world's current energy needs. With the potential exponential increase in nanotechnology when applied to the harnessing of solar radiation, it's estimated that this medium alone could supply the Earth with all its energy needs 1,000 times over in the not too distant future. Which isn't really that surprising considering that the energy from the sun's rays hitting the surface of the Earth is 10,000 times our energy use. Tidal has been estimated to supply 34% of the UK's energy demand, for example, and wave power could supply 50% of all the world's energy needs if applied strategically. And then there's geothermal energy, which has been estimated to contain enough energy potential to power the world for the next 4,000 years if applied with this systems theory approach to planetary management. So now we have an abundance of clean, renewable energy. Next, we need a system to manage and distribute this energy. The most effective tools we have for this job are computers and artificial intelligence. Computers can process trillions of bits of information a second and help us to arrive at more appropriate decisions in our economic operations. We would, of course, look to localize energy production based on proximity to the surrounding potentials, with redundancy protocols built in at every stage of development. So if there's a drop of supply in one energy medium, then another can pick up the slack automatically. There's no need to vote for it. It's self-evident and would react in much the same way your body's nervous system does. Whilst this may have some complex variables, it's really nothing more than a glorified calculator. This example given with energy would serve as a proxy for the method we would use in all other areas of the economy. In fact, this approach is already used, albeit in often unappreciated and detached ways, such as restocking at shopping centres, the ink level notifications on your personal printer, and the thermostat in your fridge. All we are doing is scaling this practice out to make sure that we are maintaining maximum efficiency and a balanced load economy. So let's run down a brief list of some other essentials that need to be met for human society on our new planet Earth. Food, water, housing, transportation, general safety, and education and culture. When using the scientific method applied to agriculture, we find that our current methods of food cultivation are environmentally destructive, outdated, and very often detrimental to human health. By the use of hydroponics and aquaponics, we can produce an abundance of fresh, organic food for everyone and are able to do so locally with a negligible effect on the environment. Hydroponics is the growing of plants in organically nutrient-rich water, which uses 1/10 that of modern agricultural methods. And when grown in rotating cylinders like this, we're able to use less light and can use gravity to trick the plants into growing up to 5 times faster than current farming methods. Aquaponics combines the cultivation of aquatic animals in tanks with hydroponics in a symbiotic system. So wastewater is filtered out from the aquatic tanks to the hydroponic system, where the plants then filter out the vital nutrients needed and return the clean water back to the aquatic tanks. What I've just described is a symbiotic system of design, otherwise known as joined-up thinking, something sadly lacking in our current system, I'm afraid. And if this was housed in a building with 1 acre floor space, 12 stories high, then completely automated with the use of AI and robotics, it could produce as much agricultural yield as 400 acres of farming land, and with a faster crop rotation time as well. So when it comes to food cultivation, we really do need to grow up. Sorry. Thank you. I've got one more. The fact that we're facing water shortage issues in the coming years on a planet 71% covered in the stuff should tell enough of its own story as to how ridiculously moronic our current practices are. But are there more effective ways of producing clean drinking water? Yes. There are a few, but the most popular one is desalination, which removes excess salt and other minerals from polluted or seawater to make fresh drinking water. There's also a new device called an atmospheric water generator that can actually produce fresh drinking water from extracting it from the moisture in the air around you. Around half of all non-renewable resources used on this planet go to construction. And in the UK, for example, 40% of that goes to waste. Fortunately, robust design and delivery of buildings is now a reality through advents such as 3D printing and mechanization. Here are some designs from the Venus project of homes that are built with sustainable practice in mind from the outset. Energy conservation is built in at the design stage, utilizing such technologies as photovoltaic paints to pull in solar radiation, the thermocouple effect to regulate temperature, and the thermosiphon effect to keep that temperature distributed evenly throughout the building. Dome shapes are utilized to reduce resource use and provide better protection from the elements. Homes are designed to meet the needs of the occupants rather than hobble together as you go along. This is what true sustainable design looks like. Our traditional aesthetic notions of what a home should look like are simply not relevant when aiming to live a life in tandem with the surrounding environment. And as for the situation of our homes, this would be up to the individual, of course, but in order to achieve maximum sustainability, efficiency, and localization of operations, then the circular arrangement is the most equidistant and optimal for a community to adopt. The city is divided into different belts relative to functional necessity. There are recreational, energy and agricultural belts, temporary and permanent dwelling areas, and as we move into the centre of the city, there are schools, research facilities, art, music, exhibition and conference centres, childcare, distribution centres, and a hospital. All functional aspects of the city, from food cultivation to sewage systems, are run by a combination of autonomic sensors and a computerized management system in order to maintain peak efficiency. The design is split into 8 for several reasons, but one of them is so that no matter what belt you are in, you're never further away from receiving medical care than if you were in that same belt in any other section. Whereas in our system, if there's an ambulance trying to get to someone dying of a heart attack in a traffic jam, then rich or poor, I'm afraid they both stand the same chance of death. Your bank balance won't mean much to you then, I'm afraid. Inside the city, transport would be by monorail, except for emergency vehicles. And if necessary, cars could be booked out and returned when you finished using them. We can now build electric cars that can drive themselves, do not crash into each other, and go at speeds of up to 100 miles an hour for 200 miles with no need for recharging. But the patents for this battery technology are withheld by the automotive industry to maintain market share. Long-distance travel would be by maglev trains. These trains are suspended on a rail by magnetism to reduce friction, and if housed in an airtight tube, they can go at speeds of up to 4,000 miles an hour safely. They are clean and use 2% the energy of planes. A health system that works to prevent rather than cure will be the main gravitas of an RBE. But what about safety from harm and crime? Well, what is most crime generated by? In a word, scarcity. If we can create an access abundance and a more equal, egalitarian society, then studies show that we can get rid of most crime in the long run. Living arrangements and production methods would be designed in such a way so that you would not have to bear the burden of owning things. You can if you want, and in some cases it will be entirely necessary, such as underwear. But largely it would probably be the equivalent of hoarding shopping trolleys. The question is of utility. It's not communism, it's common sense. Ownership is an outgrowth of scarcity, and this value system that proclaims that everyone should own one of everything is childish, grossly inefficient, wasteful, and will ultimately result in ecological suicide. With nothing to own, there's nothing to steal, and no vanity can be attached to having status symbols via ownership when everyone could just get one for themselves if they really wanted to, thus decreasing the propensity for envy, shame, and ultimately violence. This, of course, brings up the human nature question. I don't want to spend too long on this topic as it's very well covered in modern scientific literature and in the first section of the film Zeitgeist Moving Forward. But if our nature shows one thing, it's that we're not particularly constricted by it. We make all sorts of different living arrangements and showcasing our great ability to adapt to changing circumstances. So human behaviour cannot and should not be judged out the context of environmental influence. There's long been an argument of nature versus nurture going on for a long time now, and only recently has it been found that it's in fact nature via nurture, not versus. Genes are not independent initiators of commands, they must be triggered by the environment to come into effect. Education is of the utmost importance in an RBE. The smarter our kids are, the richer we will all be. You'll be taught to stand on your own 2 feet, and if you want to change something in this society, then you're going to have to work for it via learning and proving that your idea works, and not just getting your own way because you have more shiny gold coins than someone else. We would raise our children to go beyond and surpass our prior societal constructs and cultural limitations. They'll be taught to understand that anything they contribute to society will be of both benefit to them and the rest of their fellow human family. Social interest must become personal interest if we wish to survive and prosper as a species on this planet. So rather than educating towards specialization for a slot in the job market of an increasingly obsolete system, we would instead emphasize a generalist point of view to promote a more comprehensive thinking pattern, whilst encouraging people's intrinsic motivations and interests to flourish. Numerous studies now show that our current methods of grades, praise and punishment are actually detrimental towards creating intrinsic motivation, which is the origin of true creative potential, problem solving and positive social skills. Human beings are biopsychosocial organisms that need more than just the basics to survive. So we must encourage our children to develop meaningful social values, positive relationships, and encourage collaboration if we would like them to grow up in a more peaceful and sustainable world. An RBE is, and eventually has to be, global in nature, and cannot function with the price mechanism holding it back through its inherent tendency towards self-maximization, monopolistic collusion, hierarchical dominance, and scarcity-reinforcing mechanisms. Money is not a science. It's not an irrefutable law of nature. We made it up. It's a belief system, a form of faith, a religion, and not a science. Whilst it was once a useful method to manage scarcity, we've simply outgrown its usefulness. Buckminster Fuller once said, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." And this is exactly what we must do. We must build a socio-economic system that does away with the mechanisms that produce contrived scarcity, war, poverty, debt and servitude, and we must do this in a very real, feasible and technical way, and not via some meaningless paper proclamation, political decree or set of man-made laws. Because the planet really doesn't care about the lines in the sand that we made up once upon a time called countries. In fact, it doesn't care about our existence at all. It's just a little organic synergy ball flying through space obeying the laws of nature. It's a spaceship. And when you go on a space mission, the system you employ on that shuttle is an RBE. If you use the system we currently have on board a space mission, then the astronauts would probably end up killing each other before they got off the ground. Which is effectively what we are doing by using this archaic and outdated system here on Earth. It's time to leave the dark ages behind us and move into a new age of human flourishing and prosperity. It's not a utopia, it's just going to be a damn sight better than what we have now. So here comes the elephant in the room. How do we get from here to there? Well, the question of transition. This brings us to part 2, plugging into the transitional grid. As has been stated earlier, the real transition is a transition in values. Will this happen overnight? No. Are there groups out there who, whilst perhaps not aligning with our solution proposals entirely, are nonetheless seeking to address some of the important attributes we discuss? Yes. This is why the lineup for ZDAY this year is comprised of speakers from exterior organisations, to showcase the work that they are doing to help bring about this transition in their own way. At this stage, the fact that we perhaps do not agree with every aspect of what each other is talking about is superseded by the more important necessity to work together. For if any one of the organisations here today were to make progress in meeting their objectives, then this can only be a step in the right direction if you ask me. For it will only help to give people the breathing space and perspective in their lives to step back and see the systemic flaws inherent in this system and say enough is enough. Divided we're conquered, and united we kick ass. Or something like that. So let's introduce the lineup of speakers for today by aligning these organisations with an important aspect of what we address in our materials and in turn metaphorically plug them into our transitional grid, if you will. Because this system is on a collision course with itself and nature in a few different ways through its inherent mechanisms, I'm afraid. The first is the sort of money we use. Money created out of debt via a system known as fractional reserve banking. This helps to keep everyone under pressure to turn over ever more money to keep the system going. But as we've seen, the crashes are getting closer together and the debt crisis won't go away whilst the solution is to create more money out of debt and apply interest that didn't exist in the initial loan to begin with. So let's plug our first speaker into the transitional grid, Ben Dyson, founder from Positive Money. Ben will talk on the immediate solutions that Positive Money are offering to address this issue. Another threat to our current socio-economic system is the displacement of humans in the job market by machines, otherwise known as technological unemployment. Technological unemployment is often referred to as the contradiction of capitalism because the market system needs people to have jobs in order to have the purchasing power to buy the goods and services for sale in the marketplace. However, if companies have to automate jobs to stay competitive, then the workers that the machines displace will not have the money to buy the goods that they're turning out. In an RBE, we of course welcome mechanization of mundane, repetitive and dangerous jobs, as it would free people to live the lives they want to do, whilst increasing our efficiency and accuracy in the production of goods and services. So the goal of any sane society should surely be to use technology to achieve full unemployment as quickly as possible, not to provide people with joyless, dreary, monotonous and most likely socially meaningless job roles just to make ends meet. Let the machines do the work. That's why we create technology, to make life easier so that we can play. So let's plug our next speaker into the transitional grid, David Wood from the London Futurists and Humanity Plus, who will be discussing Moore's Law, the coming singularity, and what these trends could mean for the future of the job market and our way of life in general. As we've long intuitively suspected, human beings are far healthier and happier in a more egalitarian society. But we now have the evidence to back this up. Once your country has got the basics of life taken care of, you can literally measure your social health by how equal that country is in terms of wealth distribution. So let's plug Sean Bain, Chair of the Equality Trust, into the transitional grid to discuss the excellent work they've been doing to highlight this point and talk more about their organisation. Communication is a major part of how we perceive the world around us and informs our patterns of thought and behaviour through the command and use of language. But our language itself is in fact very old, ambiguous and riddled with higher order abstractions. This will be something we'll have to address in the future in order to communicate more clearly. But in the meantime, the language we do use is often used to blame, punish or incite violence rather than attempting to meet human needs. A proven tool in conflict resolution is that of non-violent communication. So our next speaker to plug into the transitional grid is Darren DeWitt from the Centre for Non-Violent Communication. Then after lunch, we'll take a look at the difference between the law and the legal system, and the ways in which we may be able to challenge the establishment without breaking the law. Laws are of course a patchwork solution for a problem that we either don't know how or are unwilling to solve. Problems equal profit. So our next speaker to plug into the transitional grid is documentary filmmaker John Webster, who will talk about legal fiction and introduce you to your straw man. Be the light of change you want to see in the world is a quote we often use in our materials because it's the only way this transition will occur. But I think this next speaker has taken this phrase to another level. So the next person to plug into the transitional grid is Mark Boyle, author of Moneyless Manifesto, founder of the Free Economy community, otherwise known as the Moneyless Man. When joining the movement, I felt so passionately for the need to get this message out to the kids in school that I set up a website dedicated to enable members to do just that, called TZM Education. If you'd like to help me in doing this, then please do visit my site and get in touch via the contact section. The second aim of this site, however, was to point out the sort of educational system we would need for the train of thought for necessary for an RBE to come to fruition. Little did I know that there was already an organisation who'd taken that aim one step further in an attempt to bring autonomy to the educational system by actually giving a voice to the people who are affected by it most, the kids. So the next dual speakers to plug into the transitional grid are Luke Flegg and Charlie Shred from the educational forum Change the Future. And we finish the day the way we started, by joining the dots. Undoubtedly, we all have our own ideas of how this transition will occur, but one thing's for sure. If the people and groups of good conscience and wisdom do not unite and call on each other's support to change the world for the better, then this transition is simply a pipe dream. So enter our last speaker into the transitional grid in the form of Grant Dive from the Unity website, One People, One World. And we have our plugs, or dots, if you will. Join them up, and what have you got? Transition. The Zeitgeist movement also has exciting projects on the horizon to aid in this transition, such as the Global Redesign Institute. This will be a website launched by the movement that takes a country as a localized example of the train of thought we advocate and feeds in the data of the area based on collected statistics to prove that it can be done if the people want it. There are many seats at the table of the transition party, so please do find yours. There's room for everyone. This world-changing stuff does indeed take quite a lot of hard work and patience, I'm afraid. But anything worth doing is always hard. Updates in human values or understanding don't seem to come all that easily to us, unfortunately. This resistance to change is partly due to our egotistical tendencies. I mean, heaven forbid we should actually be wrong and learn something, eh? But it's also not helped by a system in which an established institution must remain relevant to the culture in which it exists, thus fighting any emergent understanding deemed a threat to the perpetuation of that institution. It pays in our world to say you're right, even when you're wrong. But it's in us valuing discovery with an air of humility when new evidence comes to light that we will slowly erode this tendency. This is not a political idea or some new world order Illuminati plot to take away all your stuff. And it's not some weird death cult where you have to sacrifice a goat to Peter Joseph upon entry. Besides, if we did make him our leader, it would only end up like this. It's simply a technical plan that's completely feasible if the people of the world want it. Force is simply not an option to meet these ends. Violence begets violence, and that doesn't seem like the best route to creating a peaceful world to me. Besides, on a practical level, it's not actually all that effective. The most effective route is non-violent, non-participation in this system wherever you can, and to try to live a life that is as conducive to these aims as possible whilst communicating a feasible alternative along the way. There are no guarantees this world we speak of will come to pass, and no final frontiers if it does. If you choose to walk this path, then be prepared, because it will not be without incident. But when it boils down to it, the only relevant question to ask is whether there is a need to get from A to B. If the answer is yes, then the choice is clear. We must act. Saying I don't know where I fit into this transition yet is fine. But doing nothing when you know that something needs to be done is simply not an option when you view the world through the prism of integrity. And it is this virtue, and whether we as individuals choose to live a life in accordance with it, that will ultimately decide the collective fate of our species. For a long time now, the world's religious leaders, philosophers and writers have been proposing notions of how the world can become a more peaceful, happy and joyful place in which for us all to live. But the ability to technically achieve the abundance required for such a globally collaborative system was never a reality until now. We've achieved so much as a species, and to our knowledge are the greatest evolutionary success story this universe has ever created. Quite simply, we are amazing, and together there's nothing we can't achieve. We've changed before, and we can do it again, but not without effort. So I'm afraid the first change has to start with you, not someone else. In the final analysis, we are one people, and we share one planet. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed it.
So that talk should line up a few of the other talks that I'm going to include from ZDAY in London this year on the radio show for you to check out, and obviously all the organisations within that lecture I would strongly recommend checking out as well, and seeing whether any of your talents can be applied to helping any of them, because they're all doing good work. Okay, onwards and upwards. The next thing on the hit list for today is the starting of section 2 of the book The First Civilization by Jask Archer. If you want to read along with me online. You can get through by just typing the first civilization, Jask Archer, into Google, and you should get through to the PDF via there, or through the Zeitgeist Movement's website. So we're on to page 33 of the first civilization, section 2, questions, concerns. Quote, all truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as being self-evident. Arthur Schopenhauer. We've spent some time talking about exactly how a resource-based economy might work, and we've discussed some of the positive changes it would be able to bring for our species. However, there are a number of potential issues that might be taken against the RBE concept. Many of these are objections that have popped up throughout the internet in response to the RBE idea. Although some of them are quickly revealed to be knee-jerk reactions based on superficial evaluations of the idea, many of them are honest, well-thought-out questions that need to be addressed. A few of them are questions that I've been asked personally whilst talking about the RBE idea in casual conversation. Before we begin talking about how we could go about testing an RBE, I'll attempt to answer as many of these queries and objections as I can think of. Here we go. What if someone wants more than they need? For example, what if someone wants 150 pairs of shoes or a 5,000 square foot home all for themselves? Forget about human needs. Aren't human wants infinite? This is essentially a question of values, and addressing it requires us to answer 3 questions. Why do people value material things so much? What is so wrong about wanting lots of things? How do we change people's values so that this kind of dilemma doesn't come up in an RBE? The first question addresses the basic value set that defines life in a capitalist society. Why do people love material things so much? Many people derive a huge amount of pleasure from buying things and owning things. There is a term that describes actions from which people derive massive amounts of pleasure, even if that action provides no psychological benefit: addiction. An addiction is best characterized as a hijacking of the reward pathways in the brain, wherein someone experiences an action as being so rewarding that they are unable to stop performing it, even if it provides no benefit or is actually harmful. On the one hand, the body derives pleasure from jogging because it increases physical fitness. People derive pleasure from spending time with friends and family because it fulfills our basic human need to socialize. On the other hand, some people derive massive pleasure from the act of shopping, even to the point of not being able to fully control themselves when on a shopping spree. This is in spite of the fact that this action, and almost always the items being bought, have no real benefit for the mind or body. This is very much characteristic of an addiction. In this regard, a shopping mall is fundamentally identical to a crack house. The only difference is that one is more socially acceptable to enter than the other. Furthermore, we often have a tendency to think that our worth as a human being is measured according to the number and quality of things we possess. In fact, from the day we are born, we are taught that this is the case, whether it is through advertising, the various holidays which have been reduced to gift-buying orgies, or through the stress and trauma induced by this society which encourages addictive behavior. We are constantly reminded that we are only loved and respected based upon our ability to accumulate and display our material wealth. As a child and teenager, I was obsessed with various collections, which I protected as if they were my children. No matter how large any collection was, and no matter how much money I spent on them, it was never enough. I always wanted more. During my university days, I was well on my way to becoming a typical materialistic elitist, attempting to display my social status through expensive clothing and an attitude of superiority. Although I was eventually able to outgrow these addictions, many people never do outgrow them. Instead, they will continue to be trapped in a vicious cycle, making a purchase then expecting great happiness for all of the 5 minutes before their attention turns to the next thing they need to buy. For people trapped in this cycle of fruitless purchasing, there is simply no such thing as enough. a strong indicator of a powerful addiction. So to answer the first question, why do people value material things so much? In short, we live in a society which actively builds in us an irrational addiction to material things, regardless of their usefulness. But is this really so bad? What exactly is so wrong about our society's addiction to materials? From the perspective of our capitalist economic system, this addiction is the best thing that could possibly happen. By ensuring that people have a constant need to buy and own things, we are better able to sustain economic growth. However, from the perspective of real life, this addiction is seriously damaging on a personal, social, and environmental level. It is personally damaging in that we experience a great deal of distress when we do not possess an object of our desire, regardless of its usefulness. Think back to all of the negative health effects of stress. A materialistic person will have a much more difficult time achieving lasting happiness because there are always more things to accumulate. As soon as the thrill of obtaining the last item wears off, the happiness derived from it goes away too. The inability to achieve lasting happiness is seriously detrimental to one's overall health. The addiction is socially damaging in that massive amounts of slave labour, mostly child slavery, in developing countries is required to feed our appetite for things here in the developed world. Even in an RBE, it would still be socially damaging in that the resources spent feeding one person's addiction would mean that those resources cannot be used for something more objectively useful. In addition, one might expect to face some degree of social ostracism for using resources in such an irresponsible way, especially considering the relatively high amount of convenience and luxury that can be achieved while remaining sustainable. Lastly, the addiction is environmentally damaging in that our insatiable need for things requires the expenditure of vast amounts of resources at a rate that is faster than what is sustainable. To make matters worse, high amounts of consumption also mean high amounts of waste, as indicated by the landfills and dumping sites that now cover much of the globe. So why is our addiction to material things worth getting rid of? Simply put, it is a losing situation for almost everyone and everything on the planet. So how would we avoid this addiction in an RBE? For individuals born into that society, the answer is quite simple. Without the societal pressures that build a materialistic addiction in us, there would be no reason for it to manifest. Remember, an RBE would have no advertising, no forces encouraging materialism, and would be a far less stressful and traumatic society. Furthermore, it would be a society in which people are educated to think about how their actions will affect society and the planet. Obviously, the mass accumulation of things is not really of benefit to anyone. Basically, an RBE is an environment that fosters the opposite of materialism. It is an environment in which people are taught that every human life is worthwhile regardless of material possessions. People are educated to be more socially responsible, and positive contributions to society are what is valued. However, this still does not answer the question of how we actually go about changing the values of those people alive today. Unfortunately, like any addiction, the healing process cannot begin until the addict admits that they have a problem. Stop and think for a moment about the materialistic addiction I described above. Does it sound like your life? Might you be addicted to things? Many people will probably deny this, citing excuses such as, "I like to shop because it relieves stress." I should point out that feeding an addiction is often a great way to temporarily relieve stress. Others might say, "I need all of these things to live." Objectively speaking, this is absolutely not true. Denial is very much characteristic of an addiction. And of course the classic, "I earned all of these things. Who are you to tell me I'm wrong for wanting them?" There may be some truth to this assertion. I should stress once again that I'm not here to pass judgment on what is right or wrong, but I would have to respond to this with two questions of my own. Even if you did earn them, which as we'll discuss soon is not always the case, are all of these inanimate objects actually doing you any objective good? Also, is your material success worth all of the negative personal, social and environmental consequences? I cannot answer these questions for you, and I honestly don't expect anyone to completely change their values based on reading a few paragraphs in some book. However, what I do hope is this will at least get people thinking more about the impact of their actions and the benefits and drawbacks of their values. Sometimes, all it takes is the honest asking of a simple question to completely change the course of a person's life. This is ultimately the single most difficult aspect of transitioning to an RBE. Even if we have all of the technical aspects of this system described and planned out perfectly, we would still need for the whole of the planet to voluntarily change their values. Instead of our values being dominated by materialism and greed, we would need everyone to begin valuing sustainability and cooperation. How can we possibly hope to accomplish such a lofty goal? There are basically three major steps that need to be taken in order to do this. 1. We first need to convince people that the concept of an RBE is actually technically possible and would improve our standard of living. This is the primary purpose of Section 1 and Section 2, so we are already making progress on this front. By giving people a concrete idea of what this potential future would be like, we are much more likely to convince people that it would be worth pursuing. And at the individual level, the pursuit of an RBE begins entirely with a change in one's values. 2. The actual transition needs to be a gradual one. Despite the clear failings of capitalism, we cannot expect that people will just suddenly decide to change everything that they value. Likewise, we cannot suddenly change our global society and expect the process will go smoothly. In the same way that environmental changes need to occur at a rate which the surrounding plants and animals can keep up with, this massive shift in the way we live must occur at a rate which our species is comfortable with. We need to give our species adequate time to allow for the necessary shift in values to occur. That amount of time will be discussed in Section 3. 3. We need a working example of a community based on the principles of an RBE. No matter how good this idea sounds in theory, we need to have a working example that actually shows people how much better their lives would be. In this way, we would actually inspire people to want to change themselves rather than just telling them that change would be a good idea. This would also have the benefit of greatly reducing the necessary transition time required for our society to adapt to this new idea. If people can see the benefit of this new value system, they would be much more likely to accept it and want to change their own values. As you'll see in the next section, the creation of one or more example communities is a critical aspect of the proposed plan for testing this system. Statement: insert economist here, has already proven that this idea cannot work. This assertion is based on the work of early 20th century economists and essentially takes the form of two problems: the economic calculation problem and specific critiques against information processing in a centrally planned economy. The first problem goes something like this. An economic system without price would not work, because there would be no way to set a value for goods and services. How then could we possibly figure out a rational way to allocate them? This conundrum is called the economic calculation problem, and at first glance this logic seems quite sound. However, this assertion makes the daring assumption that the market actually allocates resources in a rational way, an assumption that is difficult to defend when one looks at the world that this method of distribution has created, where two identical articles of clothing can have wildly different prices just because one has a brand name label on it, and a small portion of the population controls a huge percentage of the planet's resources. Whether such a method of distributing resources is rational is seriously questionable, but I won't linger on this question any longer for a very important reason. The ability to assign prices to goods and services loses any and all meaning in a post-scarcity economy. We can think of it in terms of the law of supply and demand. This economic rule dictates that as the supply of a good or service increases, the price for it must drop. Likewise, as demand for something decreases, the price for it drops as well. Therefore, if we could reach a point where the supply of something was vastly higher than the demand, the price would become so low that it would become indistinguishable from zero. This could be done in two ways. We could either reach a point where we are able to provide a much greater supply of goods and services than what is needed, or we could reduce the demand for them dramatically. In an RBE, both of these moves would be taken. By creating an environment that no longer precludes individuals to materialistic addiction, there would be a massive drop in demand for essentially every kind of commodity. By taking advantage of automation and largely removing the need for human labour, the supply of goods and services would be able to vastly surpass the demand. What is the point in charging money for shelter or food when there is more than enough of either to satisfy the demand of every individual in that society? Why charge money for access to goods when they are so abundantly available for access? If the price of everything in a society was essentially zero, there would be no longer any logical way to distribute goods and services based on the price mechanism. Without the ability to assign a value to anything, there would no longer be any reason to maintain a currency of any kind. This is why price would not be used in an RBE. It would simply serve no rational purpose. But if we cannot make use of the price mechanism, then how do we figure out a way to allocate resources? The traditional alternative to a market-based system is a centrally planned system, one in which a group of people decide how the economy will be run for their entire population. However, this kind of system has been criticised because of issues relating to information. How do the planners receive the necessary information to make informed decisions? How can something as complicated as an economy be comprehensively planned by one group? Won't there always be an informational disconnect that exists between the population and the planners? It becomes quickly apparent that the centrally planned economy is not very plausible alternative. It becomes quickly apparent that a centrally planned economy is not a very plausible alternative to the market system. However, we overcome the limitations of central planning in an RBE by making use of the survey system, in which planning is not centralized. It is actually dispersed through the entire population. By having economic decisions made at the level of each individual, we greatly reduce the complexity that the planners, the members of the population, have to deal with. Each person has access to the information necessary to make their own economic decisions, the person's own consumption habits. This information is then sent and processed by the global databases, which are themselves distributed networks. Since the population has already done much of the work planning, the databases are responsible simply for execution of the plan, a purely algorithmic task based on rules of priority, as we discussed in the previous section, which is precisely what computers excel at. A system in which the population is in direct control of their economic lives has been called a participatory economy, or PARECON for short. This kind of system offers an alternative to the market system while overcoming the informational disconnect that plagues a centrally planned system. Logically speaking, it is only because of the invention of the internet that this kind of system is even possible. An invention which would have been difficult for the economists of the early 20th century to predict. What we ultimately need to keep in mind is that the basis of every school of traditional economic thinking is scarcity. The idea that there is not enough for everyone, and the dramatic effects this reality has on human behaviour. This concept is the foundation on which all of the economic systems of the past and present are built. Scarcity is as fundamental to traditional economic thinking as the value of pi is to geometry. Traditional economic thinking, therefore, has little or no validity in analysing a post-scarcity economy. It would be like trying to do geometry in a world where the value of pi is a banana suitcase. Even the most basic of assumptions no longer holds true. Does this mean we shouldn't try to evaluate this system at all? Of course not. What it means is that we would need to get some concrete data regarding this system before we simply begin condemning it, especially based on thinking that is not even applicable to its function. As of right now, the RBE idea rests entirely on theory. The theory seems to be strongly in favour of an RBE's success, but a good theory is one that can stand up to experiment. This is why it is so important for us to test this idea, as we'll discuss further in the next section. We have no prior data to base assumptions on. Rather than evaluate an RBE using the very boxed-in and closed-minded worldview of traditional economics, this could actually result in the establishment of a completely new field of study. This field could be called post-scarcity economics. In this method of thought, we would need to break free from always analysing things in terms of price. We would have to lose our basic assumption of scarcity and all of the effects that scarcity has on the way humans behave and interact, that humans are naturally violent and greedy. It would require us to begin analysing things simply as they are, with no prior basis towards the system which currently rules the globe. The simple fact is that a post-scarcity economy has never before existed in human history, and we need to recognise how strange and alien this type of system would seem from the perspective of traditional economic thinking. Unless we are willing to examine this system from a much wider perspective, it will be impossible for us to make any accurate evaluations as to its function. Question: the ability to own private property is a fundamental human right. In a certain sense, I actually agree with this statement. I think every human has the right to safely possess the things they need to survive without fear of these things being damaged or taken away by someone else. However, this is not necessarily the same as private property. Private property is a means to secure access to resources when resources are scarce. That is, by claiming an object or resource as my property, I can access it at will and prevent others from accessing it without my permission. But this entire enterprise becomes largely pointless once we overcome scarcity. There is no longer any reason for me to hoard resources in order to secure access when everything I need access to is abundantly available. In essence, the right to own private property is superseded by a much more fundamental right. Every person has the right to have their needs met without worry. By providing abundant access to all of the necessities of life, there would be no need or logical reason for anyone to desire or steal your personal goods in an RBE. Just because there are no laws specific to the concept of property does not mean that people would not still respect the goods being used by another person. After all, everyone else has everything they need to survive, so there would be no reason for them to want to take anything of yours. By creating this kind of environment, we ensure that the right to have one's needs met is always respected. That being said, the assertion of private property as a fundamental human right within the capitalist system is seriously flawed. If property is a universal human right, then why are there so many people in the world who don't own a single thing to their name? Why do so many people have their property forcibly taken from them if they cannot afford to pay for it? Clearly, our capitalist system does not treat property as a right at all. We treat it as a privilege. If you are fortunate enough to possess enough fancy pieces of paper to secure your property, your rights will be respected. If you lack these pieces of paper, you suddenly lose any and all rights you supposedly possessed. Some might argue that the ability to possess money has earned them the right to that property. However, a fundamental human right is, by definition, not something that needs to be earned. It is owed to all humans by default. That is why it's called a fundamental human right. As for the notion that money represents the work that someone does, well... Statement. Money is not a meaningless construct. It represents the amount of work a person has done, how much effort they have expended, or how difficult their life is. This claim is one of the many largely false claims about capitalism which are obscured by glimmers of truth. The idea that someone with more money worked harder or has had a more difficult life than someone with less money. Admittedly, there are numerous cases where this assumption holds true. Many business owners begin with a small amount of capital and are able to vastly increase their wealth over time through hard work and dedication. This claim probably also holds true when we are looking at very small income brackets. For example, if you were to compare your life with someone around you whose annual income is within $5,000 to $10,000 a year of your own, it actually makes sense that those who put in more effort would have more money than those who expended less effort. However, as soon as we begin to extrapolate this concept across wider income levels, it immediately falls apart. For example, a construction worker performing 12 hours of back-breaking labour for 5 days a week will likely make a fraction of the money made by a manager at that company who never has to put in more than 40 hours a week. Of course, you might argue that the manager exerts more mental effort than the construction worker. However, even in terms of mental effort, the link between money and effort is still difficult to prove. A hard-working CEO with an advanced education will have a salary that is literally hundreds of times greater than a hard-working scientist with an advanced education, even if both individuals are working essentially around the clock. You might argue that the scientist is not under as much pressure as the CEO, who maintains a company that must be accountable to hundreds of thousands of workers and shareholders, even if said scientist is attempting to solve a societal problem that affects the lives of 1 billion people. However, if being under pressure should equate to higher pay, then why does the average CEO in America make more than twice as much money as the President of the United States? Does running a large company really entail more mental strain than running a country with a population of over 300 million? And of course, we haven't even touched on the ludicrous paychecks of professional athletes and entertainers. Granted, many athletes spend long hours training and preparing for their chosen sport. However, the level of pay an athlete receives varies wildly depending on which sport they're playing and where it is played, often factors completely independent of how much effort is being expended. As for the pay of Hollywood actors, does the craft of acting require so much effort that they must be rewarded millions of dollars? If so, then why are there so many struggling actors who work just as hard but might never see enough money to make a living from their craft? The entertainment industry as a whole is an excellent example of how the link between money and effort is shaky at best. Why do some recording artists rake in millions of dollars from their music, while other artists who work just as hard will not even make enough money to pay their rent? The reason for this mostly falls on things like marketing and popularity. But neither of these are necessarily reflective of the effort expended by the artists themselves. You might then argue that this is a question of skill. The people who make the most money are simply more skilled at their craft than others. If this were the case, then why is pop the most profitable type of music, despite being notorious for the lack of skill required to create it? If you're still not convinced of the questionable link between money and effort, there is still one last case that displays this fallacy more than any other case: being born into wealth. There are vast numbers of people who are simply born into wealthy families, never expending any substantial amount of effort in order to earn their affluence. They grow up with every advantage required for them to retain their affluence into adulthood, completely independent of how much effort they expend in comparison to their less fortunate counterparts. Indeed, I would say that this category contains the most numerous examples of the shaky link between money and the difficulty of one's life. Ultimately, unless we are measuring and comparing the amount of calories burned per hour between two individuals with different jobs, the entire notion of effort is largely subjective. There are instances in which the link between effort and money is very clear, instances where it is difficult to discern, and instances in which it is completely non-existent. The last case is perhaps best seen when we examine the relationship on a global scale, comparing the very richest people in the world to the very poorest. The idea that the wealthiest people in the world work harder and have more difficult lives than the highly impoverished is pretty laughable. In fact, I hereby state an open challenge to the CEO of any Fortune 500 company who wants to prove me wrong. Go to an impoverished African village with an interpreter, walk up to a malnourished child and deliver the following communication to them. The reason I am one of the richest people in the world and you are struggling to meet your most basic needs is because my life is so much harder than yours. I think the sheer ridiculousness of that last statement pretty much sums up my whole argument. While reading my response to this particular query, you might think that I'm simply being bitter towards a class of people who have a lifestyle that I envy. If that is the case, then allow me to tell you a little more about myself. I am one of the aforementioned people who was born into above average wealth. I consumed far more than I needed, all whilst expending hardly any effort of my own. During my short adulthood, I spent some time living a life of material wealth and affluence, and I learned firsthand just how empty and meaningless this lifestyle is. Most importantly, I have witnessed the ugly side of this kind of life. When I said that a materialistic person can never achieve lasting happiness, I wasn't just guessing. I was speaking from experience and direct observation. It is commonly thought that anyone who complains about capitalism is doing so because they've been a victim of it. However, I'm not a victim of this system. I come from the part of society that is doing the victimizing. I have personally lived the kind of lifestyle which I am now speaking out against. The kind of lifestyle that is signing the death warrant for our species. Capitalism may have been very kind to me, but I cannot overlook the fact that it has been nothing but cruel to the majority of the world and completely ineffective at managing society. And we're going to stop just before the next question, which is, what about people who don't want to join this new society? And we have stopped on page 39. So we'll pick it up there in the next radio show. Some interesting points raised there. I could possibly add a few of my own to a few of those questions, as I'm sure you probably could as well, or at least your own perspective on how to answer them. But it does also give a decent perspective on some of the ways you may choose to answer some of these questions. So I hope you found that useful. So that's the end of today's show, and I'd like to finish today's show echoing a point I made at the end of my presentation at this year's ZDAY pertaining to integrity, but a slightly extended version of it that I did at the end of one of my presentations that hasn't really ended up online, and I'm not sure it will. So it's really coming at the end of outlining the problems rather than going into the solutions, but nonetheless it's a call to arms based around the value of integrity. So I'll leave you with this, and I'll see you at the next show. I sincerely hope that I've raised enough doubt about the current state of human affairs for you to see that the institutions we have in place today only work on an extremely limited basis, if at all, and that should hopefully be enough for you to check out in the detail required our materials and take action. But sadly, sometimes that just isn't enough. We've been numb to the suffering portrayed through our televisions. We've become numb to the suffering felt by many of our human family across this beautiful planet that we all share. And when we stand up and say enough is enough, we are told that we are small and the system is big, and that change on a huge scale will not happen in our lifetime, and that it's better just to be ignorant and live in bliss whilst the world crumbles around you. 'Cause hey, you've got a life to lead and things to achieve. What can little old you do anyway, huh? And you know something? They may actually be right. But whoever said life was about achieving a finish line? It's a ride until the end, plain and simple. There are those who see things differently on the ride, but choose to hide from the action needed in the fear that striving to change the things that need changing would outcast them in the eyes of others, and that scares them so much that they choose to do nothing. Then there are those who also see things differently and choose to strive in life to make the ride a better one for all, regardless of those in society who would ostracize them due to how unrealistic their aims seem from their limited perspective. Who see injustice and fight it, who when encountered with violence oppose it, who at the end of this ride want to know that they did it right, and to hell with what others deem a worthwhile achievement. They don't live in fear of being outcast. They fight for what they believe in because it is right. They recognize that it's not a measure of one's sanity to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. They don't strive for some pot of imaginary gold at the end of the rainbow. They fight for what makes sense, and that is their pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Ignorance isn't bliss, my friends. It's the last bastion of the beaten. As Mahatma Gandhi once said, be the light of change you wish to see in the world. Thank you for listening.
Our society will go down in history as the lowest development in man. We have the brains, the know-how, the technology, and the feasibility to build an entire